"Sir, we've finally found you." The voice came from a black SUV parked outside the Meridian Hotel. But the man they were searching for wasn't inside the hotel. He was sitting on the freezing pavement beneath a golden awning, wrapped in a torn blanket, looking like a man who had nothing left. Just minutes earlier, a wealthy hotel guest had kicked his only meal into the rain. The man hadn't shouted, he hadn't cursed. He had simply knelt down, picked up the empty cup, and held it in his hand for a moment before setting it gently beside him, as if even a crushed paper cup was something he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Across the street, Claire Bennett watched. She had just finished a double shift at the hospital. $4 in change in her pocket, a granola bar she'd been saving for the walk home, rent 2 months behind. She had every reason to keep walking. Instead, she crossed the street. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't know why a black SUV had just found him. And she certainly didn't know that the stranger sitting in that torn blanket was hiding a secret powerful enough to threaten one of the country's largest companies. Claire crouched beside him. "Are you hurt?" The man looked up. Before he could answer, the SUV's rear window lowered again. The man in the dark suit leaned forward. "Sir, we've been looking everywhere." The homeless man slowly shook his head. He didn't want them to find him. The window rose. The SUV disappeared into traffic. Claire stared after it, then looked back at the stranger beside her. Something about the way he'd refused that man bothered her, not because he looked frightened, but because he looked like someone who was used to being obeyed. She couldn't explain the thought. She only knew she couldn't leave him there. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Claire had no idea that helping a stranger on a rainy night would eventually put her face to face with one of the most powerful men in the country. And she had absolutely no idea that someone inside his company was desperately hoping he would never be found. 40 floors above the city that same night, in a boardroom still lit long after the building had emptied, a junior executive's voice was tight. "If we don't find him before the shareholder meeting, everything changes. The bylaws are clear, 90 days missing, and the board can vote to reassign controlling authority." A man near the window, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, listened without turning around. His name was Richard Voss, and he had served on the board for 11 years, always the reasonable one, the calm voice in the room. That calm had bought him a kind of trust no one thought to question. He let the silence stretch. Then quietly, almost gently, "Don't find him." "Sir, you heard me." Nobody in that room understood yet what those 3 words would cost, or how far Voss was willing to go to make sure the man beneath the golden awning stayed lost. He wouldn't give his name at first, only shook his head, teeth chattering too hard for words. Claire walked him to an all-night diner and ordered 2 coffees with the last of her cash. Finally, he said, "David, just David." She went home, unable to stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her, not grateful, but recognized, as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected about the world. Days became a quiet rhythm after that. She brought him coffee when she could spare it, sat with him on her way to shifts, learned the particular economy of his silences, the way he answered some questions fully and let others die in the air between them, never explaining which was which. She found herself, more than once, walking a longer route home just to pass his corner, and telling herself it was only concern. One evening, sitting across from him with nothing but the sound of traffic between them, she asked, without meaning to sound as vulnerable as it came out, "Does it bother you that I don't know anything real about you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "It bothers me that you deserve to," he finally said. "Not that you don't have it." She didn't know what to do with that. She went home that night, turning the sentence over, feeling something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with curiosity anymore. It was 2 weeks before she noticed the pale line circling his wrist, the unmistakable shape of where a watch had sat for years, protecting a strip of skin the sun hadn't touched. She almost asked. She watched something flicker and close behind his eyes before she said a word, and let it go instead, filing it away the way she'd learned to file away the parts of him that didn't yet add up. That same week, her landlord's warnings grew sharper, and one night, worn thin from 2 jobs and a stranger she couldn't explain to anyone, she snapped at David without meaning to, told him she was tired of caring about someone who gave her nothing back. He didn't defend himself. He only said quietly, "You're allowed to be angry with me. I'd rather that than you pretending you're not." It disarmed her more than an apology would have. She apologized instead, and something between them settled into a new, more honest register. After that, less careful, more real. Voss's phone rang late one night. Any movement? None yet. He hasn't resurfaced anywhere public. Keep a man near the hotel. That's all for now. He hung up without urgency. This was still the quiet stage, watching, waiting, patient the way a man is patient when he still believes time is entirely on his side. Weeks passed before the next unmistakable sign. Sharing tea on overturned crates, David glanced at a clear evening sky and said, without emphasis, "It's going to rain hard tomorrow, around 3. Claire laughed. The forecast promised sun all week. The next day, at 3:10, the sky split open without warning, so fast that 2 blocks over a mother was still fighting to get her daughter's stroller under an awning when the gutters began to flood. Claire heard about it secondhand. A little girl nearly swept off her feet, saved only because her mother had, unusually, brought a rain jacket that morning. Claire came home to find David gone from his usual spot, drenched, sitting in her stairwell instead, refusing to explain why he'd moved. "You knew," she said. "You knew, and you didn't just mention it. You did something with it." He wouldn't answer. It was the first time she understood, clearly, that his strangeness wasn't passive. It acted. She didn't yet know in which direction, and for the first time, that not knowing frightened her a little. David's tenderness revealed itself in smaller moments, scattered through the following weeks. He gave half his dinner to a teenager sleeping 2 doors down before touching his own. He gave away the good blanket Claire had bought him to an older man coughing through the cold, and took the thin, torn one back for himself without a word. When a shelter volunteer offered him new boots, he refused. There's a man 3 names down the list. His are through at the soul. Claire began keeping a mental list of every time he put himself last, and it grew faster than the list of mysteries. Then, one night, she came home early and found the garage door cracked open. David sat alone on his crate, a small folded scarf, pale blue, worn soft at the edges, pressed against his face, his shoulders shaking without sound. She didn't go in. She watched him fold it and tuck it inside his coat, the way a man handles the last thing he has left of someone, and backed away before he could know she'd seen it. She lay awake a long while after that, aching for a grief she couldn't name, and wasn't sure she'd earned the right to ask about. At a cafe sometime later, a receipt lay carelessly on a neighboring table, invoices a small business owner had been reviewing on his lunch break. David murmured, almost without meaning to, "Someone's been skimming from your supplier account. Check the 3rd line." The man went pale. Weeks after that, he tracked David down outside the shelter, gripping his hand too hard. "You saved my company. I need to know who you are." David only said, "Buy your employees lunch sometime," and walked away. Claire, watching, understood something new. These weren't just clues anymore. They had consequences that followed him home. She started to wonder, with a chill she didn't share with him, how many people out there were now looking for the man who'd fixed their lives with a single sentence and vanished. Her own walls kept closing in her father's medical debt, 2 months behind on rent, Mr. Petrosky's warning on the stairwell. She told no one. One brutal night, she found David drenched outside the hospital again. "You can't keep doing this. You'll die out here." "I know," he said. "I have a garage, just for tonight." He hesitated, glanced toward the street, that old habit of checking who was watching, and nodded. Within a week, Mrs. Alvarez warned her gently. Petrosky threatened her lease outright. Patricia told her plainly, "You can't save everyone, Claire. Sometimes you have to save yourself first." There was one night the fear finally won. Exhausted, carrying 8 months of grief and 2 months of unpaid rent, she said quietly, "Maybe everyone else is right about this." She watched something wounded move behind David's eyes before he could hide it. "I didn't mean that," she said quickly. "I'm scared, that's all." He nodded slowly, but the silence that night carried a weight it hadn't before. And later, lying awake, she understood that she had just learned something about herself she didn't like. That fear could make her cruel to the one person who'd never once been cruel to her. The second stage of Voss's search began not long after. A man in a modest coat stopped Claire outside the hospital, calling himself a family friend, concerned for David's well-being. It was Voss, warm, convincing, describing a history of instability, of vanishing on people who depended on him. He held out an envelope of cash, not quite offering it. "Tell me where he's staying." Claire hesitated. Rent, eviction, the fear still raw from days before. The words were nearly out of her mouth. Then she thought of the scarf pressed to his face in the dark, of him refusing new boots for a stranger's sake. I don't know who you're talking about, she said and walked home with her heart pounding. That night she asked him directly, is there anything about your past you should be telling me? A long silence. Someone is going to try to make you distrust me, he finally said. I need you to wait until you hear the truth from me first, she agreed. The doubt didn't fully leave, and for the first time, she realized she was afraid not of him, but of losing him to whatever it was he was protecting her from. Voss, back at the glass table, no longer patient, she said nothing. She's protecting him. Then we stop asking politely. He picked up the phone. Start the story. I want doubt in that house before he ever sets foot back in this building. This was the second stage, no longer watching, now working to poison the ground before David could stand on it again. One evening, cleaning the garage while David was out, Claire found an envelope tucked beneath his blanket, thick with cash, far more than any homeless man should reasonably have. Her stomach dropped. When David returned, she held it up, voice shaking. What is this? He looked at the money, then at her, something folding in his face like relief. It's not what you think. I've been leaving money for people. At the shelter. Under doors. I don't take credit for it, she wanted to believe him. Days later, she overheard the shelter's kitchen manager describing an anonymous benefactor who'd covered a family's overdue utility bill, no name attached. It matched, down to the handwriting, but it didn't answer where the money had come from in the first place, and that question sat between them, unspoken, for days afterward. Before the fall, there was one good night. David fixed Claire's dripping faucet with nothing but a butter knife and patience, and when it finally stopped, she laughed. Really laughed at a story he told about a man sliding slowly out of his chair during his own presentation, without anyone stopping him. He watched her laugh with an expression somewhere between wonder and grief. Eleanor used to laugh like that, he said, before he could catch it. Claire went still. Who's Eleanor? His face closed like a door. Nobody. I'm tired. But that same night, over foil-wrapped diner leftovers, something in him softened instead of shutting. Thank you, he said. For all of it. I don't think you understand what it's meant. Claire said, I think you're family now. He went quiet a long moment and only nodded. But something in his face had settled, the way a held breath finally releases. The next morning, the garage was empty. Blanket folded neatly, the way he always left it. No note, nothing. Claire spent the following days somewhere between worry and grief. The doubt Voss had planted creeping back despite everything and her resisting it. One sleepless night, she opened her laptop. The screen, the only light in the room. She typed the one word he'd let slip times Eleanor times, and sat with her hand hovering over the keys for a long moment before she let herself press enter. Some part of her already sensing that whatever she found would change the shape of everything between them. The first search gave her nothing. She added what little else she had, the neighborhood near the shelter, a stray mention of the company, the word times, executive times he'd never said, but the doorman's bow had implied. On the third try, a name surfaced beside hers, a surname she had never once heard him speak in all their weeks together. She clicked before she could talk herself out of it. The obituary loaded slowly, the way old pages sometimes do, the photograph resolving line by line a woman with kind eyes and a soft private smile, the kind reserved only for whoever stood behind the camera. Claire's own reflection hung faintly over the screen in the dark room, and for a moment it looked as though she were looking through the glass at the woman rather than at a photograph of her. Eleanor Weston, beloved wife of technology executive Wilcox Weston, passed away after a long illness. Survived by her husband, who was, according to friends quoted in the piece, rarely at her bedside in her final months due to the demands of running one of the largest companies in the country. Claire read it once. The room seemed to tilt. She read it again, slower, and this time she wasn't looking at words anymore. She was seeing the pale line on his wrist, the doorman's careful bow, the scarf pressed to his face in the dark garage, the man who fed strangers before himself and stepped on business cards, rather than let anyone learn who he was. Each memory arrived like a photograph developing in a tray, one after another, until the whole picture stood finished in front of her all at once. She read it a third time, and somewhere in that reading, the fear she'd been carrying times, is he dangerous? Is he lying? Is he hiding something I should run from times gave way entirely to something else? Grief. She wasn't looking at a threat. She was looking at a man who had built an empire and walked away from it because he could not forgive himself for the one thing all that money had never been able to fix. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark a long while, not frightened anymore. only aching, for a man she hadn't seen in 4 days, and for a woman she would never meet whose absence had apparently rearranged the entire shape of his life. What she didn't know, the man had left because time had run out. The shareholder meeting that would strip him of control permanently was 7 days away. Diane Whitfield, his longtime executive assistant, had spent 3 months quietly building a case no one believed needed building, certain he'd come back, refusing to let his office chair be pushed in. She was the one who finally found him remembering, from some forgotten conversation years earlier, that the Meridian was where he'd proposed to Eleanor. Voss entered his final stage 2 days before the meeting. No more waiting, no more quiet leaks. He summoned the 2 men who'd flanked him for months and gave them a single instruction. If the imposter showed his face anywhere near the building, security was to remove him publicly in front of any cameras that happened to be there. Let the story write itself, he said. A deranged man claiming to be Wilcox Weston dragged out by security. Nobody questions a headline like that twice. On the 4th day, Claire's street filled with cars she'd never seen there before. A helicopter descended toward the park 2 streets over. A convoy rolled up, doors opening in perfect unison, a dozen executives forming a corridor along the sidewalk. Someone whispered a name Claire now recognized from a search bar at 2 in the morning. Then David stepped forward, in a coat that fit like it had always belonged to him, hair combed back, beard gone familiar and unrecognizable at once. Before Claire could move, Voss's voice cut through the crowd, harder than anything she'd heard from him before. This is absurd. This man is not who he claims to be. He's an imposter exploiting a family tragedy for financial gain. He turned, and for the first time Claire saw uniformed security closing in from both sides of the corridor, radios crackling, moving with the deliberate calm of men who'd been given very specific instructions. "Remove him," Voss said. "Now in front of everyone. Let them see exactly what he is." The crowd gasped. Cameras that had been idle suddenly lifted. For one terrible moment it looked as though it might actually happen, hands reaching for David's arms. The corridor of executives faltering, unsure whether to intervene. It was Claire who moved first. She stepped off the curb and planted herself directly between David and the advancing security, her voice shaking but carrying. He predicted a storm 3 weeks before it happened, and it saved a child's life 2 blocks from here, asked the mother. Her name is in the emergency room log from that day. He caught a fraud at Kessler & Sons that the owner will swear to in front of any camera you want. He's been leaving cash anonymously at the 5th Street shelter for months. The kitchen manager has copies of the notes. I have his handwriting. I have dates. I have a business card he stepped on because he didn't want to be found, and I kept it. She pulled the crumpled card from her coat pocket and held it up, her hand steady despite everything else about her shaking. You're the one who doesn't want him found. Everyone here should be asking why. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Diane Whitfield stepped out from among the executives, folder against her chest, and walked straight to Claire's side rather than past her, a small thing. But it changed the shape of the crowd instantly, 2 women standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a dozen hesitating men in suits. Diane looked at David, held his eyes a long moment, and said, clear enough to carry across the street, "Welcome back, Mr. Weston." She lowered her head. One by one, the executives did the same, security stepping back uncertainly, radios lowering. Voss stood alone at the edge of the crowd, his order hanging useless in the silence he'd created, his composure, 11 years of it visibly beginning to slip for the first time anyone there had ever seen. Claire stood frozen, the business card still in her hand. Weston, the obituary, the scarf pressed to his face in the dark. Wilcox Weston, founder and majority owner of Weston Industries, found her at the edge of the crowd, and for a moment the cameras, the reporters shouting, all of it fell away. He walked to her. "I should have told you, I wanted to, every single day." "Why?" she managed. He exhaled. 6 years ago I built a foundation for the homeless population in this city, gave millions, funded every study. But after Eleanor died, none of it meant anything. I wasn't there for her the way I should have been. I spent her last months in board meetings instead of at her bedside. I disappeared because I didn't know how to be a person anymore, only an executive, and I needed to find out if I still could be, before I let myself become that man again. Claire understood finally that the reveal she'd been chasing had never been the real story at all. Voss did not surrender quietly. He tried to spin the street confrontation as a security misunderstanding, then leaked a story suggesting Wilcox was mentally unfit after a prolonged breakdown. For nearly a day, it worked until the business owner from Kessler and Sons, the shelter's kitchen manager, and a woman whose daughter had nearly been swept off a curb 3 weeks earlier, all came forward on their own, having seen the story and recognized, each in their own way, the man at the center of it. Claire had called every one of them herself the night before, working through numbers scrawled on the back of receipts. Cornered in front of the full board with Diane's financial records laid across the glass table and Claire's witnesses waiting in the hallway outside, Voss's composure finally cracked. He was removed within the week. The truth spread quickly, though not the way Claire feared. Reporters wanted the billionaire who vanished story. Wilcox refused every interview centered on himself alone, insisting any coverage include Claire only if she agreed and only however she wanted to be portrayed. She declined most of it. Her landlord apologized repeatedly. Mrs. Alvarez showed up with a pie. Patricia laughed until she cried. Wilcox didn't try to buy Claire's forgiveness. He asked what she needed, and only after she'd exhausted her short, modest list did he work quietly behind the scenes, her father's remaining medical debt paid in full, her family home quietly repurchased and placed back in her name. He offered her a position at the foundation, not as a favor but because her instincts were exactly what it had been missing. She accepted, on one condition: she wanted to keep working directly with people, not managing budgets from behind a desk. Months later, Claire returned to the street outside the Meridian on another cold evening, much like the first. There, in nearly the same spot, sat another man, alone, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the weather. Claire knelt beside him without hesitation, offered a warm meal, and sat with him. "Why are you helping me?" the man asked. Claire smiled. "Because once, someone taught me never to judge a person by where they sleep." Across the street, Wilcox watched from beneath the same awning where he had once sat unnoticed, until one person decided he was worth noticing. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.